SECfans.com. Week 13, week 12 is over. Cupcake Saturday is over, and now we're into the business. And of course, we're going to lead this week off with the Iron Bowl, Alabama and Auburn. We took a week off because obviously the slate was so bad, but also we knew what was coming with this postseason, with not only what we're headed into the SEC championship game and hopefully playoff discussion and big bowl discussion for SEC teams, but this one that didn't look like it was going to be as big as it's turned out to be if we were looking at it in the middle of the season. And now Auburn has just reeled off a bunch of wins, beat the absolute brakes off of Georgia, is coming in with a ton of confidence, and we've got Alabama banged up. Also, Auburn's banged up after last weekend too, but we know Alabama is missing some real key players, maybe some to come back. I'm not sure. Let's start off with Auburn. I think we know at this point in the season what we've got with Alabama, kind of what we've got with Auburn, but I want to sort of take a lap back and talk about what we saw in the Georgia game and kind of how this sets Auburn up for this Iron Bowl. And what I want to lead into with that is this question of, is Auburn too confident because of the series of factors that have come into play with beating the crap out of Georgia and Alabama not looking great against Mississippi State? Or have they earned every bit of confidence and this game is absolutely poised to be a massive nail-biter?
Auburn has been a weird team to predict or understand all year because I feel like their performances have been usually consistent with a very good team and occasionally off. We were really, really high with Auburn to start the year. We did have them losing to Clemson. We had them beating LSU in a blowout. We had them winning every other game up until the Georgia game, and we both had Georgia, but we thought that game was probably going to be pretty close and a tough game. Obviously, neither one of us expected the result we did get, but at the same time, I don't think either one of us is surprised that Auburn's a very good team because we've had them pegged as a good team for a long time, and we both really felt like the LSU game was a weird aberration. That doesn't mean that we understand why Auburn dominated Georgia the way they did. And a lot of the discussion right now around Auburn is based off the idea that, well, Auburn is this great team, and if they can do this to Georgia, they can do this to anybody. And to a large extent, that's absolutely true. If you can beat Georgia by this amount, you can beat any team in America by a large amount. But I also think, and we're going to probably go into this a little bit with a lot of different games, Mississippi State, Mercer, and sort of look at how things play out sometimes and try to figure out what are predictive points to look forward to in terms of future performance and what are points that were the way the ball bounced, so to speak. I think Auburn's performance against Georgia was stellar. And, we'll get into this a little more when we talk about Georgia. Both of us had serious concerns for weeks about what would happen when Jake Fromm was forced to throw the ball. That didn't go overly well. He actually did okay in my mind, but we were really concerned because we hadn't seen Georgia really even attempt to run a balanced offense. When they tried that against Auburn, they ran the ball very unsuccessfully. Auburn really loaded up. Georgia only had 1.4 yards per carry in that game. And once that happened, things just kind of snowballed and broke down completely. I mean, 6.3 yards per attempt is not terrible, but when it's less than 50% and you're running for that poor yardage, you can't sustain a drive to save your life. The net result of that was Auburn with good statistics, not necessarily earth-shattering ones, but really good statistics, was able to almost completely and totally dominate this game. I think the next thing is to sort of look at, how many drives the team had. And, 12 drives, 40 points. It's a solid outing. And, in that sort of set of stuff, I think the notable thing with Auburn against Georgia was that they were able to consistently move the football. And when I say that, I mean, you look at the drive summaries and it's field goal, field goal, field goal, punt, touchdown, punt, and then a touchdown, another touchdown, one more punt, a field goal, and a touchdown. Auburn didn't score 40 points because they had 15, 16 drives like we see in some games. Auburn scored 40 points, only punting the ball, I believe, twice in the entire ball game. And if you do that, you're dominating to a large degree. And I don't care what the stats say. In fact, Auburn with 4 field goals on the day really could have won that game by a significantly larger margin. Georgia's almost lucky to hold Auburn to 40. So I think that was an absolute statement win, and you have to start with that, and you have to appreciate it. The question is, from there, how much of that can you take away and say this is something that was or was not indicative of future performance?
Yeah, and talk about real quick, because I think the drives are pretty important. And honestly, we're probably going to get into some of that with Alabama and Mississippi State later when we talk about that. But we've noted last year with Louisville, especially, I think it was the Louisville-Syracuse game, how their points relative to plays and drives weren't necessarily that good, even though the scoreboard was kind of eye-popping. So talk just a minute about how this one is kind of trending in the other direction, where it is actually better than it looks, and a situation like Louisville-Syracuse where it wasn't.
Right. So there was a game, the Louisville-Syracuse game last year, that kind of kicked off Lamar Jackson's Heisman campaign. And we kind of lamented the fact that, due mainly to turnovers by a terrible Syracuse team, Louisville got the ball, I can't remember, it was 11 or 12 possessions in the first half. And they scored, I forget, I think 5 touchdowns by Lamar Jackson. It was, wow, 5 touchdowns and a half. And we looked at it and said, yeah, but they had an entire game's worth of possessions to play with. And they were more likely to go 3 and out or turn the ball over than they were to actually score points in that ball game. Not that that's unusual, but the point being, that's not necessarily complete and utter earth-shattering dominance. I think that same week we noted Vanderbilt put up, I think it was 27 points, and actually scored more points per possession than Louisville did, and they put up something like 60. And it's a crazy number, but that was just how many possessions they had in that ball game. It was absurd. Auburn is absolutely the other way. They didn't have a ton of possessions in this game, and when they had a possession, they scored almost every single time. They had one drive where they went 3 and out, and well, I guess really 2 drives sort of towards the end of the first half. They went 3 plays for -8 yards and 3 plays for 4 yards, and then they had one more 3 and out that was about midway through the game when they were already up 30-10. Outside of that, they scored quickly, often, and consistently. If I were to have one knock, it's that as the game went on, they started scoring almost too quickly. They weren't really sustaining drives, but it's hard to throw that away when, again, they had an 8-play, started the game with an 8-play drive, then a 12-play drive, then another 8-play drive. You're going to have some 3 and outs. It's going to happen to every team. But when you can consistently move the ball like that, that's not saying you got lucky or there was one big play here or there. You can't really point to any specific little thing. Auburn scored because they were gonna score. It was almost an inevitability with the play, the play results that they had, the fact that they were getting over 5 yards per play in a lot of these drives, and whether they scored quickly or slowly didn't really matter. It's a high level of dominance, and it's kind of the opposite of the Lamar Jackson scenario where you say, well, they just had a lot of drives. They benefit greatly from what the other team did wrong offensively, where they got the ball a ton and that they sped up possessions, and the stats are misleading. In this case, this game could have drawn out forever, and Auburn would have scored 1,000,000 points. Or if this game had been shortened to a really large extent, the way the Alabama-Mississippi State game was, Auburn still would have been ahead of Georgia almost certainly. They just dominated just about every possession. Maybe not always scoring touchdowns, and I get that, but the fact if you can continually put up points and move the football, it's exceptionally difficult to beat a football team.
So before we get into these matchups, and we're going to talk specifically about how Alabama matches up with Auburn and vice versa, I want to talk real quick about Jarrett Stidham. We've done this a few times this year where we noted, okay, this is the guy coming into the season. We were real high on him, and I think he's sort of satisfied our preseason, not necessarily hype, because we had tape on the guy, and we thought he was going to be pretty successful. We didn't know how successful he would be in this Gus Malzahn offense. If you're putting your critical hat on, and this might make Auburn fans mad, but that's okay. We make everybody mad. We're equal opportunity in that regard. If you're putting your critical hat on, would you say that this performance against Georgia or his performance this year indicates or illustrates or reflects him hitting that ceiling or that mark that we had for him preseason, or has he fallen a little short of it?
I think he's hit the mark. He's over 9 yards per attempt on the season. He's only thrown 4 interceptions, 18 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. This is kind of what we expected. We expected a play action quarterback with a big arm that can make a lot of throws. We did not necessarily expect a gunslinger that was going to be asked to throw the ball 40 times a game. I think that was a little unrealistic. It's funny, we did a preseason quarterback video where I thought we were actually pretty darn positive of him. We noted, um, our prediction for him was that he would be Bo Wallace with a slightly better arm. In good Bo, not bad Bo. Bo, people say good Bo, bad Bo. Wallace had a
good Bo that beat Alabama.
right. Wallace had a few games where he just didn't prepare, didn't show up mentally, and was terrible. And the rest of the time, he was a 9-10 yarder attempt quarterback, threw for 3,200 yards in 2014. And the reason we made this comparison was not so much his arm talent, but the fact that I thought he was about the same speed. Bo Wallace was actually the number 1 junior college dual threat quarterback when he came out, and they're almost exactly the same size. For whatever reason, people latched onto that and really tore into us because I think somebody told me that he's a 4.4 and I don't understand how a guy that can, somebody said, I don't understand how a guy could run a 4.3 could be slow. I'm not saying that Stidham is slow as molasses, but there were some really unrealistic expectations from a very select number of fans that he was going to come in and be Nick Marshall. He's a completely different quarterback. He is a guy that can be mobile, that can pick up on a bootleg a touchdown in the red zone, which they ask him to do a lot. But you're not going to run the zone read with Stidham on a continual basis and be successful. His skill is accuracy on the deep ball and just general arm velocity and arm talent. He opens the playbook up, and you can attempt any throw on the field. Something we made a point of is I think to a certain extent, it's overlooked how effective White was last year for Auburn in a lot of games. He led the SEC in yards per attempt until his late season injury. And we kind of noted that they're going to miss certain things with White because White could consistently move the football in the short to intermediate passing game. But there were a lot of things White can't do. And what you're seeing out of Auburn is an offense that just looks a lot more complete and interesting because they can call any play they want and they know their quarterback can actually execute it. There were a lot of passes that White, frankly, didn't have the arm strength really to do. And as much as he was deadly accurate within about 15 yards, if you wanted to throw a flag route 30 yards down the field, it was questionable whether White could really hit it. And what we see from Stidham is the opposite. It's a pro and a con because in some cases he's very good and he can open things up, but he's also not quite as consistent. And I think an interesting thing that's played out over the course of the season is I see a lot of Baylor in him still. He likes to go for the jugular very quickly, and he's real quick to pull the trigger. And sometimes if that clock gets sped up in his head a little bit, he'll take the deep shot maybe when he shouldn't. I think the LSU game was a case in point for that. I don't think that was the Auburn coaching staff. Baylor is a single read offense. They'll throw the deep shot and single man coverage every chance they get. And I felt like mentally he reverted back to the Baylor quarterback in that game. Took a lot of unnecessary deep balls. We talked about this to a large extent. The run prevalence in that game wasn't as bad as the fact that they went almost totally vertical in the passing game and gave up any threat of the intermediate to short passing game that really should have balanced the run game. So those are the pros and cons of Stidham. I have no problem with that. I think he's done exactly what he's asked to be done. You can't expect perfection for a quarterback. Not everybody is Deshaun Watson. And to a large extent, my view of him is he's just a really effective guy when you have a strong run game that can pick up big plays all over the football field. I don't know that he's the guy you want if you were going to throw it 40 times and try to play some sort of West Coast offense where it's lots of short passing games. I don't know if he's the quarterback you want if you're Washington State, but if you're a play action football team, I think he's a very, very good quarterback and really met any expectation that I had for him going into the year.
All right, so let's dip into. I want to talk a couple of high level things about Alabama relative to Auburn, and then we want to get into the numbers because I think one of the things that we do pretty well on this channel is showcase what our computer model says and then pivot off of that to not only discussion but kind of how we feel the game will flow or deviate from what the numbers say. So before we get into that, let's talk real quick about schedules. So at this point in the season, Alabama and Auburn both have a number of common opponents, and we don't really play the transitive property game here. And we've got enough mixture of both that we can't really glean a whole lot of, yeah, one is going to win over the other based on transitive property. But just looking at those collection of games, is there anything that we can glean out of it? And if we are going to glean something out of it, is the Mississippi State game the one you would go to since it's the most recent and since it's probably, one of the two really good teams that they share in common?
Well, the common opponent thing is really interesting because you can look at single snapshots of either team and make this case for why your team is the dominant one and the other team's going to lose. And you can already see sort of fans doing that, I think, on both sides. It's dangerous. You can't take single snapshots of games and apply it unilaterally and say, well, clearly we beat X and they didn't. Auburn throttled Mississippi State on the scoreboard, and because of that, there's a lot of Auburn fans that are crowing. But Auburn also lost to LSU, and Alabama beat LSU by multiple touchdowns, and that's causing some Alabama fans to crow a little bit. Obviously, Alabama didn't have the chance to play Georgia, but that game was probably the most dominant win, in my view, for either team, given the quality of the opponent they were playing. But I think an interesting thing to sort of compare the two results and talk about how different bounces of the ball, and this is why I brought this up earlier, have given different understandings for games that were a lot more similar than people expect. The first one is the Mississippi State game. The first thing you have to note about Mississippi State's strategy when they were playing Alabama is that they slowed the game down to an absolute crawl. We talked about per possession dominance by Auburn against Georgia, but I think a lot of times people, when you watch a game, see how the game's going in real time and feel like their offense is lethargic because they haven't scored in 30 real time minutes. And you have to be careful because sometimes you're playing a team that's burning clock really quickly. And so maybe it's been a long time, but it hasn't been a lot of plays. Sometimes you're watching a CBS ball game and there's 38 commercials between every snap of the football. But I think to a large degree, sometimes per possession comparisons are the most useful to figure out a team does. Against Mississippi State, Alabama had against Mississippi State, I will say, in the first half. Again, we talked about against Georgia, Auburn had five and a half drives. Depends, clock was running down late in the game. So, maybe 6 possessions against Georgia. And in that game, they were able to score 16 points in those 6 possessions. Against Mississippi State, they had 8 possessions in the first half. And on those 8 possessions, they were able to put up 21 points. They scored 3 touchdowns out of 8 drives. So less than 50% of Auburn's drives in the first half resulted in points. With Alabama, due to the way Mississippi State played that game, Alabama was 9 minutes to go in the fourth quarter when they got their 8th possession. And at that point, they had 24 points. So Alabama actually scored more frequently in a possession sense. They scored on 4 out of 8, where Auburn scored in 3 out of 8 possessions. The difference was Auburn managed to get those 8 possessions in a half, and it took Alabama almost 3.5 quarters to get to that same point. And that changes perception. And I think, when you make the comparison of how they did and, like how the yardage and all, Mississippi State had, flip it around, and it's easy to say, well, Mississippi State was driving the ball better. Mississippi State had 351 yards at 4.2 yards per play against Auburn. They had 330 yards at 4.5 yards per play against Alabama. Those numbers are not particularly different. What was really different were the way turnovers happened, the way yards were obtained, and when they were obtained. There was a big fumble that really should have been called as a fumble scoop and score on the field, was blown dead. Reviewed it, gave Mississippi State the ball. They didn't manage to score a touchdown on that drive. that makes the game shorter because Mississippi State, well, I say shorter, that would have makes the game closer. Mississippi State would have been able to stay in their regular offense better. It also means Mississippi State probably doesn't speed up things because they're passing the football, which allowed Auburn to get a lot more possessions. So it's all kind of screwy. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to spend a minute talking about the way play order can really mess with people's perceptions. And I say this particularly for the Alabama fans that are sort of gnashing their teeth. Now we're 2 weeks later, but after the Mississippi State game.
1 minute.
Alabama, as I said, really their game against Mississippi State was not all that different from Auburn's from a statistic standpoint. Now, I'm not talking about in terms of what they accomplished, because I think Auburn game was obviously a lot more impressive due to the 49-10 score. But, Auburn outgained Mississippi State 511 yards to 351. Alabama outgained them 440 to 330. It's about 70 yards different that Auburn put up more than Alabama, even though the score game was much, much closer. And how does that happen? Well, the thing is, first, how does Mississippi State, with 110 yards less than Alabama, manage to keep the game that close? Jalen Hurts averaged 13.4 yards per attempt passing, and Fitzgerald only averaged 6.6. Every Alabama tailback in that game averaged at least 6 yards per carry. Damien Harris was 11.6 yards per carry. Mississippi State only averaged 3.5 yards per carry in the ball game. Everything was different. And the first point is dice rolls. If you're going to roll a dice and you say, if I roll a 1 and a 2 or a 2, I win. If you roll a 3 to a 6, you win. Obviously, you're at a disadvantage, but you want to roll that dice once, because if you both roll a dice once, there's a chance that you roll a 2 and they don't roll a 3, maybe you win. But if you do that 10 times or 100 times, every time you roll it, the chance goes down. And if you did that same sort of thing, you did it 100 times, took the best case scenario, you have less than a 1% chance statistically of winning that. And it's because over time, odds catch up. That's why Vegas wants to keep you at the craps table throwing your dice over the chance of a game, because small advantages eventually make it almost impossible for you to win over the long term. Mississippi State knew that, and they shortened the game. And by shortening the game, they allowed a lot of probability and chance to come more into play. One of the major things that happens in a ball game that everyone's aware of is that third down's important. But I'm not sure that people necessarily understand how much it's important or why. And it's because every time you get a first down, chains reset and plays reset. So a play that gains large yardage on third down that extends a drive is more important than a gain on first down, which simply results in another first down where you again have to get 10 yards. And so I'll give you a very specific example. Here is a look of 4 plays, the same 4 plays with the same total yardage, but in different orders. If you had a 3-yard carry and a 2-yard carry, and then an incomplete pass, but pass interference, that will result in and then let's say the next play is an incomplete pass, okay? That's a 3-yard, 2-yard, so you get 3rd and 5, incomplete pass, pass interference, 15 yards, 20 total yards. It's now 1st and 10, and that next incomplete pass results in 2nd and 10. So we're going to, I know it's confusing to hear without seeing, but let's take it and just switch up the order. Same exact plays. So our incomplete pass but with pass interference is first down. So we go 1st and 10, we get 15 yards, and we're at 1st and 10 again. Now we get our 3-yard carry and our 2-yard carry. So that sets up 3rd and 5. And if we had that 4th play that's an incomplete pass, it's now 4th and 5 and we punt. So the same 4 plays, if you have a pass interference on 3rd down, that nets you a 2nd and 10, 20 yards down the field. But if you had a pass interference on 1st down, then you end up with 4th and 5, 20 yards down the field. Mississippi State got a tremendous amount of yardage on 3rd down. And to sort of look at 10 third down opportunities in that game, there was a 15-yard pass interference, personal foul leaping call, a 10-yard run on 3rd and 1, a 10-yard defensive holding on 3rd and 5, 12-yard run on 3rd and 1, 7-yard pass for a first down on 3rd and 7, 23-yard pass on 3rd and 2, 13-yard run on 3rd and 10, 20-yard pass on 3rd and 8, 25-yard pass 3rd and 4. It was about half their yardage. Those 10 plays was 150 yards, half their yardage in the game. That was 15 yards per play from a team that only averaged 4.5 yards per play on the night. But because they had their chunk yardage on 3rd down, it repeatedly extended drives and allowed them to score. And I think the final thing I'll say on this is a lot of Alabama fans are critical of Keith Holcomb and his job in the game and their ability to stop the run. As Saban pointed out in a press conference, Alabama held Mississippi State to under 4 yards a carry, only 3.5 yards per carry. The thing that really killed Alabama was giving up multiple 10-plus-yard passes on third down, because on those examples I gave you, those 10 plays resulted in all 24 points for Mississippi State. And if any two of those, I think, 4 20-plus-yard pass plays I just described don't happen, that takes at least 10 points off the board for Mississippi State and gives Alabama another possession or two, and would have completely changed the complexion of the ball game. So that's what I wanted to get out and all that. And I think it's very important to understand from a predictive aspect, none of this is important. The fact that they got it third down instead of first down was really just oddly, there's a little bit of strategy, but it's mostly sort of luck and chance. And when we're looking forward, I don't see the Mississippi State games as being all that different, oddly, between Alabama and Auburn. The main difference was how the yardage occurred, kept the Alabama game a lot closer than the Auburn game. But in terms of their performance, the two teams are very similar.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we've talked a number of times this year also on the flip side. So that's one for Alabama. We're going to talk a little bit about the Mercer game. We've mentioned a few times this year, everybody wants to kill Auburn for, I think it was 24-10 to Mercer, but they had this weird 5-turnover game that really kept that game a whole lot closer than it would have been. And statistically, it was kind of similar to the Alabama game, and it could have been just as bad. So I think, and it's kind of interesting because we're coming off of those two games back to back. I don't think, if you're an Alabama fan, I don't think you look at that, what was it, 56-0 score and say, okay, well, Mercer 24-10 Auburn. There was first of all, it's kind of a different Auburn team. Second of all, there's a lot going on there. No Kerryon Johnson. I think Cameron Petway carried it 642 times. Yeah. The last one I want to talk about before we get into the numbers is the LSU game. We both picked LSU to get blown out by Auburn. We thought it'd be a little closer to LSU, but it wasn't. So talk a little bit about whether or not we can glean much from that LSU game, given it was kind of weird with Auburn getting up real big and then letting the lead slide away. Is there anything we can take from that game?
The biggest thing to take from that game is that Auburn had real struggles with consistency and predictability. And we talked about how while everyone points to first down, and there were 17 straight consecutive runs on first down in that game, famously, what a lot of people don't look to is what happened on second and third down. If it wasn't a short yardage situation on second and third down in that 17 run of runs, 10 of the 14 second downs were pass plays. And I think in the second half, I want to say they never ran the ball on a second or third and 5 or more. I believe that was correct. So our takeaway from that game to a large extent was we felt like there was some issue where I think Lindsey was calling the plays, especially with all the vertical shots, because it was very Chimp Lindsey. But it really felt in that game like every possession started with Gus Malzahn calling up to the booth and saying, we got to run it here. We got to establish the run. And they'd run and it didn't work. And then they'd panic because it would be 2nd and 10. And so they'd start throwing it and they'd throw and end up punting. There was no unpredictability from that offense. It wasn't very dynamic. And it was the same thing we talked about in the Clemson game. There was one point in the Clemson game where Stidham took a lot of heat for taking sacks. Obviously, the offensive line was taking a lot of heat, but people wanted to get rid of the ball sooner. And we went back and watched it. They got in such a rut of running on first down, and then not just running on first down, but passing on second down, that on a second down play, Auburn went max protect. They had 7 guys in protection with a quarterback that only leaves 3 in the pattern. Clemson dropped 8 into coverage. So you've got 3 receivers with 8 guys in coverage, and then Clemson brought 3. And the problem was they were able to get pressure. And unsurprisingly, Stidham held the ball for a long time because everybody's double covered, and eventually they got to him for a sack. That's not on Stidham. That was a problem with the play calling that Clemson was able to guess, yes, this is a pass, and we're not going to do, when you drop that many guys into coverage, you can't defend the run to save your life, but they knew whether it was a pass or run. Once they got up on LSU and they kind of, I think, went into turtle mode a little bit, so to speak, wanted to run the clock out, they got a little predictable. LSU started scoring. They got a little panicky, and they stopped trying to be an aggressive, dynamic offense. I felt like the Georgia game was a completely different story. They were very good in that game. They did a very good job of balancing the run and the pass. They've done it for a few weeks. They did it against A&M as well, and they look like a completely different football team. But my takeaway from the LSU game is I feel like to a certain extent when Malzahn feels like he's backed into a corner, he wants to sort of push and make things happen. And he loses sight of the bigger picture. And he's too focused on the current play and whatever he wants to establish right now. And he doesn't realize that sometimes you need to be unpredictable and do the thing that doesn't work. It's the classic case of why do you keep running up the middle on 2nd and 10? Well, you do it because if you don't do that, then they're going to drop 8 guys into coverage and make everything else more difficult. And so what I've seen is when Auburn is willing to let Lindsey just sort of call the plays, and I think that's the truth of it, and then they're good. But I don't think Malzahn's ever called plays really. I think he's just dictated what their style is going to be. And you need someone that's sitting there with a play sheet that is marking up every pass and every run and all the tendencies through the game. And they have spreadsheets and they cross reference it all in this big matrix so that you make sure you're unpredictable. When they do that, they're really effective. But I think the LSU game is a huge red flag that if they end up in a tight game and they get really concerned, there is a tendency from Malzahn to try to force something to happen. And when he does that, he gets predictable. And the moment you get predictable, everything becomes tremendously more difficult because the defense knows what you're going to do.
I think it's time for numbers. Like I said, we try to get into these a little earlier, and we didn't. We had a lot to talk about with this game, and we've said this before. I don't mind going long on Alabama Auburn. These important games, they're going to be long. We got a lot to say. We had a week off, so we got a lot to talk about. Let's get into the computer model. Let me know what the model says and just anything initially of interest. Like, is it right down the middle what you expected it to be, or where, if anything, did you see that was a little interesting?
Well, as we're both aware, Alabama and Auburn have excellent defenses. And one of the first things we calculate in this model is the percentage of opponent averages that you allow. And what that means is if your opponents allow normally 6 yards per carry, do you allow 4 yards per carry? Do you allow 75% of that? Or do you allow 100% of it? Do you allow 6 yards per carry on average to your opponents? And that's sort of our way of adjusting defenses to the quality of their opponents and sort of trying to evaluate them in terms of opponent strength and really give ourselves a baseline so that when you face a team that's very, very good, you have an idea. One of the things that our model has tended to be very good at is when you have really, really big teams playing, you can predict a little better how they're going to do because frequently, and I think it's going to be the case for both Alabama and Auburn, they're going to be facing the toughest defense they faced all year. And so you kind of want to have an idea, given the quality of offenses, how much are they going to decline? Because if they were to play to their expectation, Alabama and Auburn should have probably their worst offensive output of the season because these are the two best, especially in terms of run defense, probably the two best run defenses they faced. And Clemson, maybe Clemson aside, but I honestly think Alabama's probably a little bit better. So, we look at per play averages. We don't look at total yardage because that is such a product of the number of plays run that it isn't a very good indicator for relative strength. And we try to gauge how good you're going to be versus this opponent, run and pass. And from there, we do some analysis and run a mathematical model that looks at your past history to gauge with this sort of yardage, run and pass, this is the average production you should get. And looking at your past history with that production, what is an expected point total for you on offense? So that explanation aside, defenses are great. 62% of opponent rush averages allowed by Alabama, 66% of opponent rush averages allowed by Auburn. Those are absolutely elite numbers from both teams. Anything below 70% is elite. Anything below 60%, and you start getting into like historical comparisons. And neither one of these is probably quite at that point, but if you're below 70%, you're one of the premier run defenses in the country. Not surprising in either case. Against the pass, Alabama's giving up 75% of opponent averages. Auburn's giving up 78%. This isn't shocking. We've again, we say anything really less than 80% is probably elite. Less than 80% is usually on the elite side. If you get less than 75%, that's when you kind of end up becoming the stonewall. It's really hard to hold teams to a low percent of passing averages for a variety of reasons. It's easier to make an impact against the run, but really good quarterbacks tend to be successful to a large degree, irregardless of opponent. So these are actually really good numbers from both teams. The one caveat there, and it's we've noted this a number of times, is Auburn's pass defense was extremely well regarded early in the season. We felt like Alabama was probably a little bit undervalued there. Auburn was probably a little bit overvalued, but it's nitpicking at this point. They're still elite on both sides of the ball. So when you take that and you apply all these numbers and you run it through a model, what is the end up result there? And the result is unsurprising, which is neither one of these teams is expected to run the ball particularly well. They should be able to pass it okay, but not great. Alabama should be average right at 4 yards per carry. Auburn should be held under 3.5. 3.3 yards per carry is all this is predicting. Again, if that sounds absurd, you have to realize that both of these opponents are probably the best you're going to see all year in terms of run defense. The interesting thing to me is that the passing averages are predicted to be the same for Alabama and Auburn. Both are expected to get 6.8 yards per attempt. I think there's a preconception in a lot of people's minds that Stidham is a lot better than Jalen Hurts. Therefore, Auburn's passing game has an advantage. I don't know that I totally buy that, and it's going to be due to the receivers. We'll touch on that in a bit, because when you look at the passing game as a whole, and whatever advantage Auburn has, which may be slight, it tends to be negated because Alabama's secondary is so good. The net result of that is you have a 5 yard per play average from Alabama, 4.6 yard per play average from Auburn. And you run that through the model, look at past history. Alabama is a little bit better at scoring than Auburn is. And what I mean from that is, like Auburn fans have seen, Auburn tends to stall a little bit in the red zone more often than people probably would like. Alabama's a little better about punching it in, scoring touchdowns, a little bit better in the turnover front at times. And so even though the 5 yard per play, 4.6 yard per play differential, it's predicting a 26-19 Alabama win over Auburn.
What you touched on something there that I thought was pretty interesting, and I think it's worth exploring. And we've seen Auburn, obviously against Georgia, be able to stop a really impressive running attack, one that hasn't been stopped all year, frankly. And we've seen Alabama be able to shut down basically every run game they've ever faced. But we also know that they've got some injuries there. Let's say I'm gonna go both ways with this. Let's say both running games are shut down, and kind of like we expect, maybe even worse. And it's all on the arm. I think you sort of indicated where you'd go with that. But which team is more equipped to handle that situation where the running game is just getting just no joy at all?
It's a difficult question because I honestly think they're both so poorly equipped for it, to be very frank. When Stidham has not had a complimentary passing game, he has really, really struggled. I think a lot of it is due to the fact that he's early in the system. A little bit of it's due to pressure. He hasn't responded very well to the blitz. But, in those couple games where they haven't gotten much in the way of the run, and really Clemson and LSU are the two examples, but those were also really the two games where they didn't run the football very well. They weren't great. And, looking back at it, they've only been held under 5 yards per carry 3 times. It's really 4. It happened in Mercer too, but that's a little bit weird because you've a lot of other factors there. But LSU game, Clemson game, Missouri game. And in the Missouri game, they were able to put up a ton of points because Missouri was sold out completely against the run. And their defense is basically a wet paper bag the moment anybody gets the football that happens to be outside the perimeter. So the receiver game and the receiver screens was killed them. It's kind of a different animal. But for the most part, they really struggled in a lot of those games. But at the same time, I don't know that we've seen anything from Jalen Hurts that makes me think he can sit back and be a dominant pocket passer either. And again, Alabama has struggled at times running the football. They struggled against LSU. They struggled against Mississippi State. And I think this is the weird thing. when they were held to under 4 yards per carry as a team in the Mississippi. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong stat here. When they were held at under 4 yards per carry against LSU, they were able to get some plays through the air, and we talked about this a lot. I actually felt like Hurts played a really good game. He may not have been statistically good, but they had about 3 drops that killed him. He didn't have any protection, and he stepped up. And I mean, to a large extent, I kind of feel like it's a draw, but
It's a draw on quarterbacks, but when you talk about offensive line and wide receivers, I mean, we saw with LSU, I don't think Auburn's receivers, and we've not been high on Auburn's receivers, full disclosure, for a couple of years now. Um, LSU's secondary being able to play man to bottle up the run game and kind of free them up, they really struggled. So if we're talking about just comprehensive passing game and not just quarterbacks, when you take into consideration offensive line and wide receivers, does that tip the scales for you?
and I think it does. That's where I was going to get with that. It's Calvin Ridley usually can make a play in a game. He's going to get open because he's extremely difficult to cover, and he's going to make a play. And Alabama's receiving core, in my opinion, has a tremendous amount of depth, probably more so than just about anybody else in the conference. Maybe Ole Miss accepted, but they have a ton of weapons, and the freshman receivers they've got are kind of phenomenal. So I think Auburn's guys are starting to come on, but they're still pretty unpolished, and they've really struggled when they faced lockdown secondaries. So if I have to make a hedge, I do think it's Alabama, and I think it's because they've got a couple guys, Devontae Smith, the freshman, Calvin Ridley, that have the potential to create separation and to make a play, go up in the air and snatch the ball away. I know obviously Auburn receivers can do that. They scored a touchdown doing the same thing against Georgia, but I think you also have to look at the other team, which is important. And in this game, I think Auburn's secondary is very good and disciplined, and they don't screw up a ton. But I do think Alabama's secondary is better. The corners are very good tacticians and almost always in position to make a play. And Alabama's safeties are extremely good, assuming Minka Fitzpatrick is healthy. The calculus changes a little bit if Alabama has Tony Brown in that nickel slot because I don't think he's a particularly good player in a lot of ways. But if they've got Harrison and Fitzpatrick back there, it's two of the best three safeties in the country, depending on if you want to put Derwin James in that mix. And it just gives them it makes them extremely hard to throw on, and every deep ball is a risk. So I do actually strangely would hedge to Jalen Hurts as the passer in a game where neither team can really run the ball.
So the flip side of that is let's say for argument's sake, so we know about Alabama's linebacker injuries, and I think we saw Deshaun Hand limping around a little bit. Ray is out, broken foot, so just infirmary ward all over the place. Alabama injuries, and we've talked about Mississippi State's success on third down, running it up the gut on Alabama, which we haven't seen a lot. Auburn had some injuries. We don't know because Gus is such a closed box on injuries. Saban's not really open about it, but he's a lot more open and a lot more straightforward about injuries than Gus is, which I think plays to Gus's advantage, frankly. I'd be that way too. We don't know how Holland's leg is. We don't know what some of the other guys that left the game, where they are completely. So let's say both teams are kind of banged up in terms of these run-stopping linebackers and defensive linemen. And we get into a 2014 Iron Bowl situation where one or both teams is just bombing away. Which team, in your opinion, does that favor if both teams are running and able to score and both sides are clicking on offense?
In a game where both teams are clicking on offense and really difficult to stop, particularly in the run, the team that is the most disruptive defensively is generally going to have an edge. And disruption starts with the front four. As it stands, Auburn's front four has been one of the more disruptive in college football, I think. And as much as we've criticized the secondary, it's a little weird, I think, to say we've criticized them. What we've really said, we've said the same thing about Clemson several times this year. we feel like they are a very good secondary that has an elite disruptive front four that makes them look elite, if that makes sense. And there's nothing wrong with that because you end up with the same result. But in the situation you're describing, I think the front four from Auburn is a lot more able to create negative plays, to create tackles for loss, or to get a hit on a quarterback or rush a throw. And that's how you create turnovers. Alabama has not been great at tackles for loss. One of the defining things for me in the Mississippi State game is that Alabama had not had a game with under seven tackles for loss since September. They were averaging about 9 a game. The Mississippi State game, they had 4. And the reason for that is they didn't have Sean Dion Hamilton. And without him and the way that game was played, they kind of played on their heels. And Keith Holcomb, I don't think he's as bad as a lot of Alabama fans feel like, having watched it. What I saw was a guy that didn't really know what he was supposed to be doing. I know they use him in a lot of pass defense formations, and he wasn't used to attacking gaps, plugging a hole, and he would get blown out. He'd wait on a pulling play, he'd wait. And if you wait on a 330-pound lineman to come around and hit you, he's going to knock you clean off your feet. It's just physics. He's 100 pounds bigger than you. If he's running and you're not, you're going backwards. That's an issue for Alabama because if it's in a high scoring game, they're a little more likely, I think, to be playing on their heels, where Auburn is going to continue to disrupt. And that means Auburn's going to have a lot more success on offensively because you're not going to really get any disruption. They're going to be able to stay on rhythm, where Auburn might be able to get a couple stops. And in that weird hypothetical, it reminds me a lot of the 2010 Auburn defense in that defense wasn't necessarily world changingly good, but their offense was phenomenal. But what their defense was very good at was they would get a couple stops or a couple turnovers no matter who they played, and fairly could get in the backfield and make a sack and blow up a drive. And because of that, they could get 2 or 3 stops and allow their offense to take over and win the game, particularly in clutch situations. I think Auburn has more potential of that. But, and I think this is a big caveat, injuries are a big factor. If Christian Miller comes back for Alabama, I think a lot of people think this isn't a game that it matters so much because it's so run heavy, but that was supposed to be their guy to create disruption defensively. And if he's there to pressure Stidham or to create tackles for loss, it will be a massive change. If Dylan Moses, that I think has the potential to be an extremely disruptive player because he's extremely fast, can be that guy that can get in the backfield, that will change the way I predict it. And the other thing I'll say, and I'll move back to you in a second, but I want to touch on the fact on Auburn. I think the Trey Williams injury is a lot more significant than it's being given credit for. I know Denson was hurt, Deshaun Davis went out briefly, but Trey Williams was the thumper. He was the 240-pound linebacker in that lineup. And it's a lot like Alabama, interestingly, that they use Atkinson and they use Darrell to sort of plug a guy in a lot of pass heavy sets. And when they were playing Mercer, it was late in the game when Williams got hurt. They never really had to get in a run heavy set. I'm not sure how well those guys can stand in the hole and deal with a pulling guy, just the same as Alabama had a problem with Mississippi State. Frankly, we really haven't seen what happens when those guys have to play in those formations in those situations because they were never asked to. Even in the Mercer game when Williams went out, again, Mercer was in 4 wide sets trying to score late in the game, and then they just kind of gave up. They never really had to play that. So I think it's absolutely a question mark for both teams. Again, how is Auburn going to respond if Williams is out? And I think he's the most likely to be out, given that his replacement's probably going to be 20 pounds or more lighter than him. How does Dylan Moses, a true freshman, do? Because I think he's probably going to start in face of Holcomb. That's a huge wild card. Extremely fast, extremely disruptive, but definitely not the thumper Dion Hamilton is. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I would favor Auburn in that situation based on what we've seen in the past. But there's so many wild cards that really makes it really interesting, and I think it's going to be really fun to watch.
So go ahead and tell me what your score is. The model 26-19. Are you tracking with that? Do you think it's going to be the same kind of score? And if not, what do you got?
I do generally track with the score there. I think Alabama is about a 7-point favorite on Auburn. I do. Obviously, the model score is a little weird, but I think I'm going to hedge, and I'm going to say 27-17, which is a little bit bigger. I don't have much confidence of this going into Jordan Hare, but The biggest thing to me is Dylan Moses was phenomenal against Mercer. If he hadn't been, then I would be saying this game was an absolute toss up and maybe predicting Auburn to win. I think it's that crucial that Alabama has good middle linebacker play. And what I saw was a kid that has the potential to actually make some really significant game changing plays. There's the thought that Minka Fitzpatrick sat out last week and may be healthy, and that's a huge cog in their defense that they haven't had for a few weeks now. And there's the extra wild card that Alabama may get one or two defensive players back that they've been missing for the entire season. When you put that together, that it's not a huge swing. It swings me about 3 points more to Alabama than the model. So that's how I end up with 27-17.
I got a little closer. I think Auburn plays this game really close, and I think they'll probably do some stuff like Mississippi State did because Mississippi State was so successful with every play down to 3 or 4 seconds on the clock, shortening the game. And a lot of people see that as playing scared or trying to play for the win at the end. I think it's smart against Alabama, just kind of the way they grind teams down. If you can sort of eliminate that grindy fourth quarter, any team, I don't care how good you are, how bad you are, I think that's a smart way to play. I also think even if Christian Miller comes back, even if Dylan Moses plays great, you've still got a really good offense that's played against the Nick Saban defense, had some success against the Nick Saban defense in the past. I know it's a little bit different makeup. That I think they're going to score the ball. I just do. I think Auburn's going to score some points. I think they've got an advantage in special teams, although Carlson's great. Alabama didn't have the drop-off we thought they might at field goal kicker this year. The one thing that's kind of worrisome for me in terms of a game that might end up being a field position situation, they are a mess at punt return. Like, absolute mess. And not just, we probably should have talked about this a little bit, but not just fumbles, which are bad. The fact that Marks has had such a hard time gauging punts and giving up 20, 30 yards in field position. I think he did it 5 times against Mercer. It's a mess. And in a game where you're trying to get every advantage possible, neutralize the home field advantage, that's a big deal. I still have Alabama. From what I've seen with Jalen Hurts the last few games, LSU and Mississippi State, they're showing on tape that you can't just all-out blitz the guy like they were doing last year and having a lot of success. And I say basically any good defense last year, had considerable success. If not all-out blitz, a simple edge blitz was just freaking him out. He's not showing that this year. He's showing a lot of poise in the pocket. I think Jacobs is going to have a significant impact for Alabama running back. I do think Kerryon Johnson is probably the best. He is the best running back they've faced this year, and he's going to have some success. Having said all of that, I'm going to go 29-26 Alabama. Auburn fans are going to be a little frustrated that they're not getting a win pick here. But keep in mind, our model had the Auburn-Georgia game with a Georgia win close. We picked it closer. We didn't pick Auburn to win. I think I said something like 27-24. We didn't pick Auburn to win, but a lot of people that were calling Georgia blowout, we weren't on that bandwagon. And then to remind Auburn fans, our biggest miss this year was picking Auburn to blow out LSU. So we're not like against your team. We're just picking this one kind of where the numbers are taking us and how we see it. What else you got on this one before we wrap it up?
I think an interesting sort of storyline here is there are only 2 schools that have beaten Alabama within recent recruiting classes in the SEC. Ole Miss players from 2014 and 2015 beat Alabama, and redshirt seniors at Auburn from 2013 beat Alabama. At this point, those are the only SEC players to have beaten Alabama. So this game, and you can talk about how many in a row they've won, but this game is really important because really if Alabama wins this game, no Auburn player will have beaten them, no LSU player, no Tennessee player, and the only guys left are Ole Miss players that are probably going to have that win vacated anyway. So this is the shot for Auburn to stop this from becoming a situation where no one in the SEC even remembers what it's like to beat Alabama. It's incredible, it adds a lot of, I think, interesting meaning to the storyline. And I think Auburn absolutely has all the tools to win it, especially in Jordan Hare, which is such a difficult place to play nationally. And I don't say it lightly when I say it's underrated, because people talk about Death Valley and LSU. I think Auburn's statistics are a lot better than LSU's Death Valley in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting, and there's a lot on the line, not just for Auburn, but really the entire conference, in terms of sort of stopping this Alabama train from rolling all the way through the station.
Auburn fans are gonna kill you for saying Jordan and not Jordan. They're gonna kill you in the comments. I don't care. That's fun. It's a lot better, I'm sure, than the Clemson fans who just eviscerated both of us for saying Clemson. Anyway, all right. So to close this one out, we've done this so many times this year. I want to do it one more time. If Alabama wins, who's your MVP? If Auburn wins, who's the MVP going to be?
I think if Alabama wins, the MVP, it's the same for both teams. It's probably got to be the quarterback. The quarterbacks in this game are going to have to make plays, because both teams are going to try to stop the run. And Jalen Hurts can make plays with his legs and with his arm. Stidham can make plays with his arm. And I I hedge a little bit because Damien Harris and Kerryon Johnson are both so good, and Kerryon Johnson has the ability to take over a game. But when you're playing defenses of this caliber, it's the same thing that happened at Georgia. Defenses like this can stop one player if he's that dominant, if he's a skill position player. The one guy they can't stop is the quarterback. If the quarterback plays at a high level, he will take over the game pretty much irregardless of what you do. So I do think the quarterback, one way or the other, I think a quarterback is going to be the MVP of this
I tend to agree. All right, El, that's the Iron Bowl for us this year. I know it ran long, but we kind of came into this one planning. So we usually do 2 games per, so we do 2 podcasts, so we do 2 games per podcast. We plan on this one being about its own podcast. It's that important. I think it's crazy that everybody's talking about how down the SEC is this year. Alabama's 11-0, still hasn't won the division. All right, y'all. Comments. Give us your score prediction, who you think the MVP is going to be, any other data-related stuff. Alabama, Auburn fans, y'all mix it up in the comments. We're going to mix it up in there with you. Y'all, thanks so much. It's been just a fun season, and we're getting into the off season. It's going to be great. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.